Welcome to the Better Questions podcast. On today's episode, we have Emily J. Hooks, who is a forgiveness expert. And today's episode, we are doing a better conversation on forgiveness. And if you don't know, Emily J. Hooks is an author, forgiveness coach, and the founder of the Forgiveness Academy. And her work with forgiveness and healing began 14 years ago after an extraordinary journey through challenges. By all accounts, she should not have survived. And her mission today is to share the power and purpose of forgiveness with the world and to help us all realize our true strength in the absence of fear and the illusion of victimhood. And this was a great conversation, and I don't want to make you wait any longer. So here is our conversation on forgiveness with Emily J. Hooks.
Well, today we are joined with Emily J. Hooks. Emily, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It truly is an honor and a pleasure.
I was wondering if maybe we could start off by you just telling us a little bit about yourself and maybe some of your story and what drove you to the point that you are now considered an expert on the topic of forgiveness.
You know, it was not an easy path. I had a really challenging childhood, as many people do. Not maybe exceptionally challenging, but I had an abusive father and a lot of addiction in my family. My father kidnapped me when I was a little girl and hid me from my family for 3.5 years and out of the country. And so those events really affected me. And as a young person, I used drugs to manage that pain that I felt. I didn't feel like I had any other resources available, and that was very common in my environment. I had my son when I was 19. He's 28 now. And we did pretty good for a few years, but I still had not processed the trauma from my childhood. And I got addicted again in my early 20s as a mother. Ended up losing my son to my parents for 3.5, 4 years. Ended up homeless, extremely sick, almost died several times at my own hand and at other people's hands. And then a series of sort of revelations and mystical experiences happened. And I walked away from that life, and within a matter of a few months, everything had changed. And I started studying religion forgiveness from around the world, from the religious point of view and secular. And I developed a process. It wasn't developing a process at the time. I was just trying to manage living. And I kind of stumbled on the realization of just how powerful it is to liberate us from the illusion of our stories and the illusion of being a victim in our lives. And so I practiced forgiveness for 15 years. And then one day, and I never had a conversation with anybody about it because it's not necessary to do that. And we can talk more about that. One day I was having a conversation in a book club and shared my experience. And within a year, I'd written the book and dedicated my life to sharing the power and purpose of forgiveness. So,
wow, thanks for sharing that story with us. And I'm just glad that you're willing to share that story with people and that you have a platform where you're able to use that. And as we try to have better conversations and ask better questions, one of the places we always try to start from is maybe where we're getting things wrong or having the conversation wrong or asking misguided and unhelpful questions. So when it comes to the topic of forgiveness, what would you say are some of the biggest misperceptions you see that people have about forgiveness?
So probably, the number one, misconception or misperception that people have is that somehow they're going to be condoning the things that have happened, that they're giving up their right to justice in the process of forgiving. And that's just not the case. You're not condoning unfair behavior. You're not giving up your right to justice. In fact, in my opinion, justice becomes much more real because rather than coming from a place of vengeance, we're coming from a place of restitution when we learn to forgive. And so, I think that's one of the many things that's wrong with the justice system as it is today is really it's not based on true justice and fairness and mercy. It's based on control.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And kind of related, what do you think are some maybe bad questions that you've heard people ask in regard to forgiveness, if there are any?
Yeah, well, I'll say this. At the beginning of the process, I don't think there are any bad questions because, while healing takes place in the heart, we get to a place of willingness to heal by, reconciling our belief structure and our worldview with what it is we feel compelled to do to make our lives better. And so if there's confusion, and for most people there are, and the reality is we live in a very unforgiving world, and there are a lot of misconceptions about what forgiveness is and what it isn't. I just named two, but there's a long list. And so, having that conversation at the beginning of the process, being sure that, it's letting the other person off the hook or letting yourself off the hook or whatever the misconception might be, having those conversations is always helpful to reconcile how it is we can choose to do something so bold in such an unforgiving world. There is a point in the process when there are questions that get in that don't really serve a purpose. And I think that those questions are based on where we are in our development. So, questions of fairness and being really attached to the story that we have about things are really ways of viewing the world and our experiences that we develop at a very young age. And particularly if we experience trauma, sometimes we get stuck in viewing life that way. And so at a certain point, we have to recognize that in order to evolve, in order to grow, in order to be liberated from the painful perceptions we have about our lives, we have to ask better questions. We have to let go of the questions that there really are no answers to. Why do bad things happen? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. And it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think that's really awesome. I think something you said that really stuck out to me, just that was really powerful, is you talked about forgiveness being liberating, but also that it's an act of boldness in such an unforgiving world. I think that's really great.
And I would just love to know, before we get the conversation going down more specific questions, how would you define forgiveness?
I define forgiveness in the context of process, because everything that I teach, everything that I share with people is based on how to apply the principles. It's not philosophical in nature. And so the process I define as a process of self-actualization or evolution, in which we choose to move through our hurt feelings, shame, anger, resentment are the big three, in favor of or in exchange for self-love, self-compassion, and empathy for other people or connection to other people. Most of the experts in the field of forgiveness define it in a similar way in the context of it being about choosing compassion and connection over our shame and resentment and impulse for vengeance.
I've never heard it that way before. That was really good.
Yeah. So when we consider that, if we first started with the idea of when we've been hurt by someone else and we need to forgive others, why is that so difficult? Why do people struggle so much with being able to forgive someone else for the hurt that's been caused to them?
I don't think there's just one answer to that question, but I do think that to a certain extent it's cultural. It's not universally difficult for human beings to be forgiving and compassionate. There are cultures around the world that manifest that quite easily. But we live in a culture that values vengeance. We live in a culture that values, making people pay for the mistakes that they make. Part of that has to do with being in an individualistic culture. When you look at more collective cultures, like in Asian countries, the way they see forgiveness is the same, but the way they approach it is a little bit different, because their assumption is that if another person's well-being isn't considered, neither is theirs, and we don't tend to have that. So I think part of it is cultural. And I think part of it is the way we're raised, which is also cultural, but, that affects our psychology. It affects our faith traditions, or the way our faith traditions are passed down from generation to generation. I do think faith can play a big part in it. And research shows that people of faith tend to be more forgiving. But there are some unique challenges that people of faith face, because there's the confusion about, and we'll talk more about this later, but the confusion about, well, if God's doing it, why do I need to do it? And so that can create a unique challenge, like a wait and see kind of challenge, mentality with regard to forgiveness. From the psychological perspective, there's also, this sort of addiction to the drama. This addiction to the identity of being the bad guy or the victim, that really gets a lot of attention in the world that we live in today. And so we have to be willing to let go of that.
For sure. And one of the things you just said that again really jumped out and kind of segued into one of the questions we had, which you talked about the unique challenges people of faith can have when it comes to forgiveness. On one hand, they can be more forgiving, yes, because there's passages that talk about, well, you should forgive others because God forgave you. Jesus talks about that. But Jesus also then says, if you don't forgive others, God will not forgive you. And I think some Christians out there that take that very literally can maybe run into an issue when maybe faced with an experience where they need to now forgive someone, but they may not be emotionally ready to forgive. And so I wondered if you could speak to, is there such a thing as not being ready to forgive? And what would you say then to people that hold that they need to because the Bible tells them so, and they find that conflict within themselves?
Yeah. So, yes, there's such a thing as not being ready to forgive. There is a time and a place for forgiveness, and it's not always that time and that place. There are practical reasons for that too. If you're not in a safe environment, I wouldn't worry too much about forgiving the other person. I would change my environment first.
Right.
But also just in the context of faith, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I don't have any idea what the authors of the Bible and Jesus really meant. But here's how I've incorporated it into my belief structure, into my worldview. So there's the aspect of free will, which is integral to faith. And I think that the idea that both God forgives us and that we need to forgive, that paradox can be reconciled by recognizing that we can still have patience and compassion for ourselves to the best of our ability when we're not ready to forgive. And our job is to try not to create harm in the world during those challenging times. In tribal cultures, they do things very differently. So if somebody experiences what we call trauma in a tribal culture, they kind of circle around the person and they just let them just be their hot mess, whatever that looks like, just sleeping all day, laying on the ground, and whatever they need to do, right? Eating too much, I don't know. But they give them time to process the experience. And we don't live in that world. We live in a world where people are like, get over it, get back
Right.
to work. You still got your kids to take care of, you A, B, C, and D, you know? And that's just not a reflection of the way human psychology works. It's not the way the heart works. Sometimes we need a minute. And I think that's exactly what free will is. I think, you know, if we can leverage our faith to know that when we are ready to forgive, then we will also have that, you know, that forgiveness from God. Then we can maybe be a little more kind and patient with ourselves during that time.
Absolutely.
In my life, in certain experiences with people who have felt wronged or have dealt with, you know, injustice, I've witnessed people in their life come up to them and tell them they can't forgive the person or persons involved unless they repented or apologized or had paid for the injustice. And I liked what you said earlier about the culture in which we live in affecting the way we forgive. And I definitely think we live in a transactional culture where a lot of times if someone doesn't enact the transaction, we think, well, I can't do my part yet either. And I'd love to hear from you if that train of thought is healthy or unhealthy of thinking you can't forgive someone or someone unless they have done something or enacted or started repentance or apologizing.
Yeah. So one of the hardest people I needed to forgive was my mother, interestingly enough, even though my father did so many horrific things when I was young. We tend to be really hard on our moms, right? They're supposed to protect us no matter what. And it took me a really long time to forgive her. But when I did, and I never had a conversation with her about it, by the way, you know, I spent 30 years telling her how messed up she was and telling her how much she'd messed me up and trying really hard to prove her right. And I realized that that was, you know, basically I was asking her to be remorseful for my suffering. And she wasn't going to do it. My mom's kind of a badass. Or stubborn. She wasn't going to do it, and I forgave her, and our relationship completely changed. And I hated her. I hated my mother. We really had a horrible relationship, and now I adore her, and she didn't change. And so I'd like to tell that story because, you know, we tend to think that we need something from someone else in order to forgive. And that's just not true. It's okay to feel like you would prefer, you know, repentance from someone. You know, I think that that's a very human, you know, desire. The question is, you know, do you want to keep suffering? You know, really, that's the question. You know, how is it that your perception of the situation right now and an experience of unforgiveness impacting your life? And if it's impacting your life in a way that causes you to suffer, then you can choose to forgive in the absence of any remorse from another person.
I would add, I have seen what Andrew talked about, but in addition to that, one of the things I see people and myself get hung up a lot in the process of trying to forgive is getting laser focused on the question, what happened? Or like proving that my version of the events is correct, or I can't forgive until you admit that what I say happened is what really happened. And I'm curious, why do we get so fixated on that question, and what might be unhelpful about that question?
I'm not sure why we get so fixated on it, but it is a very common phenomenon. I will say this: when we get obsessed with anything, we're trying to defend a position, and that really makes sense in this context, because the reality is what happened isn't knowable. And I know that's really, really challenging for people that have experienced extreme trauma, because that's me included. And so I get that. And one of the reasons it's challenging is because a lot of times when people experience abuse, they're denied the right to their story. And that's not at all what I'm saying here. Everybody has the right to the story that they have about their lives. Nobody else gets to tell you what you think happened, right? But the reality is there's a ton of research out there that shows just how terrible we are at recalling events, especially when something goes wrong. When we have even if it's a minor traumatic event, crime scene research is a good example of this. They figured out 20 or 30 years ago that eyewitness accounts are practically irrelevant, and they don't even allow them in capital cases anymore because they're so unreliable. So that's a very, practical explanation, and it's really just a partial explanation. There's more to it than that. What we have to do in the process of forgiveness is recognize that there's a difference between what happened, the story we have about what happened, and the impact. So there are three things that we have to deal with, and part of that is recognizing that what happened is in the past, and so technically it's not knowable. The story, however, is happening in the present moment. So whatever it is you perceive to have happened is very, very real as the story that you have about it. And that's important that it's happening in the present moment because that means you can do something about it. If you're repeating a narrative that you have about something that happened in the present moment, that's a choice. And so you begin to gain just a little bit more power when you recognize the difference between what happened and the story that you have about what happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really powerful. Which leads me to kind of ask another thing, and it kind of born out of just my own experience I'm going through right now. But I'm curious. Like, you spoke a little bit about this on what it looks like. You spoke on forgiving your mom, and you could kind of show how you interacted with her before and now how you interact with her now, and that kind of speaks to what I'm about to ask. The main question really is, how do we know when we've actually forgiven someone, and what does that look like? And just a little context on the question too, like something I'm trying to unpack in my own life is like really being able to trust that I'm feeling my emotions. I think I've spent a lot of time just kind of stuffing those down. And I think if I think about forgiving someone, how do I know that I've actually done that? Or if I've just kind of closed the tap on those emotions and I've just kind of pushed it away and not truly forgiven them. Can you speak on that?
Yes, I can. So I just want to speak on the emotional aspect first because it's really important. If you go back to the definition of forgiveness, it is about processing how we feel. So you cannot forgive without processing your emotions. And behind all of the, more masculine and, enjoyable negative emotions like anger and indignation, we always find sadness, and sometimes we find fear. And so I just like to make sure that it's clear that until we go through that process of feeling those emotions, you haven't forgiven. You can offer a gesture. This is another challenge in a faith community context, is people in faith communities tend to extend a gesture of forgiveness in some communities very quickly. But that doesn't mean that the individuals have necessarily processed the pain associated with whatever it is that has happened. So that's the one thing I want to say. How do you know when you've forgiven someone? You consistently have kind and compassionate thoughts when you think of them. So when they pop into your mind, the first thing you think is, I hope they're well, right? I hope they're happy. I hope they have whatever it is that they desire that's life-affirming in the world. You don't have to think all that, but it's just a happy thought, right?
Yeah.
It's a well wish. And then you have emotional neutrality around the events. So, I can tell in great detail a lot of the traumas and tragedies that I've experienced in my life on stage because I've processed those emotions. And so I don't have, they're not triggering, right? I don't have an emotional response when I think about the events that took place. So it's compassion for the person and emotional neutrality around the events, and it's consistent, right? So.
Wow. Yeah, that's great.
So I remember one time I was at a Christian camp as like a leader, and they decided to show a movie night sort of a thing for all the students. And it was like a Christian movie about a young girl who was sexually abused. And then the rest of the movie is like the young woman learning to forgive her abuser and like that relationship being mended. And I remember, one, that was a weird movie to show at a church camp first night. I just want to address that looking back, how strange that was. But then also, I remember watching the movie, and in an hour and a half, it just feels rushed. And it left me feeling like, I don't know if that was right. Where in an hour and a half, you see someone get abused, and then by the end, there's a more healthy way of that relationship. And I would just like to know from you, what does a healthy relationship with someone who's wronged you look like? Whether that be something like in the movie sexual abuse, or even just like everyday wrongs that we have with people we work with or in our family. What should that relationship look like in a healthy way?
It should look like, an experience of having common humanity, working together to accomplish whatever it is you're together to accomplish, whether that's raising families or, doing work at a job or building community or whatever it is. So it's important to recognize that forgiveness and trust are completely independent. Forgiveness and reconciliation are completely independent. They're not the same process. And reconciliation is absolutely not necessary in order to forgive. And in a lot of situations, it's not advisable. So in the example you gave, the young woman was able to reach a place of forgiveness. And I'm guessing there were circumstances in their lives where her father needed her, and she made the choice to be present in his life. And that, that's not something perhaps everybody that would forgive sexual abuse would choose to do. And I think it's important that we not overlay moral imperative on that, right? Whether or not someone chooses to engage in relationship with another human being is an extremely personal decision. Trust and reconciliation are actually harder than forgiveness because they are interpersonal. Forgiveness doesn't require anything from anyone else. Reconciliation and trust require compromise. It requires an agreement about shared values and how we're going to operate together in a way that does not cause harm. And so it's more challenging.
I wanted to ask you one more question around this topic of forgiving others before we move on to a different one. I've heard you talk a lot about not being a victim when it comes to forgiving others. And I would be curious if, one, you would just elaborate more on that in general, but then also talk about what that looks like in a situation like an abuse setting where you are a literal victim. What does it mean to not be a victim during the process of forgiving?
So the idea of being a literal victim, maybe that's an example of a question that is more nuanced than it seems. From a sociological point of view, it's important that we recognize that people can be victimized and that otherwise we wouldn't know when somebody had done something wrong. And so I don't mean to discount the concept of someone being victimized, but there is a distinction between being victimized and having the experience of being a victim. So when we carry the burden of feeling like a victim, we we limit our capacity, and I've blanked on the word I'm looking for, we limit our capacity to feel our own power. And so it's at some point in the forgiveness process, it's helpful to recognize that no one is just a victim, and also no one is just a bad guy. You know, we're all complex. We've all been both. So when I talk about, it's important to not identify as a victim, the identify is just as important as the word victim. So it's really about how do you see yourself as a human being? Because we have to begin to reclaim some of our power, some of our autonomy, and in order to liberate ourselves from the pain of the past.
Wow, that is really good. I'm moving on just because we have to for time, but I feel like I could drill down on that even more. But we'd like to go into a different section now on like being able to forgive yourself or oneself. And so I just thought we could kick off this section just asking like, how do we begin to forgive ourselves and what is involved in that?
So we begin to forgive ourselves by getting present to the remorse that we feel. Really, it's the same as forgiving someone else. It's just a different emotion. And so in the absence of feeling remorse or guilt or shame, if it's more embodied, the need for forgiveness, self-forgiveness won't even occur to a person. And that is an example of when moral guidance might add value. So, once someone becomes present to the experience of regret or remorse, then they can begin to identify how that experience affects the way they show up in the world, because it does, even if you're not necessarily conscious to it, unless you've got, sociopathic tendencies. The pain that you feel will affect the way you function in the world. And that's obviously very, very rare. Maybe a lot of people pretend, more so people pretend, I think, than actually experience that condition. So that's how you begin, is by recognizing the pain that you feel and the limitations that you're experiencing because you're not processing the pain.
So I have met people who, when it comes to experiencing hurt from others, they're like the most forgiving people ever. And they're so quick and willing to forgive others. But then when they mess up, they're so hard on themselves. And I'm just wondering, why does it seem even harder to forgive ourselves than to forgive other people?
So interestingly, I'm working on a book on self-forgiveness, and I just finished the chapter on that very topic. And so it's fresh on my mind. I won't go into all of the reasons that I highlight, because y'all don't want to be here all night. But there are some interesting distinctions with self-forgiveness. Some of them are personal and some are interpersonal. So an example of an interpersonal is trying to prove that you're sorry, trying to prove to the other person or people around you in your community that you did bad, you did wrong, and that can kind of become mixed up in the way we identify. Speaking of identity, another reason is, what we talked about a moment ago is, sometimes people really take on the identity of being somebody that always messes things up, right? Somebody with a bad temper might be a good example of that. I'm always losing my temper, and eventually, when we don't process how we feel about that and get to the root of it, which involves, by the way, feeling the feelings, we begin to identify as that person. And so that can happen on either side, either feeling like the bad guy or feeling, powerless in our decisions. Like we always end up in unhealthy relationships. When those always start to come into the picture, then we're beginning to identify. Another reason is the way we're raised. Most of us were raised with a very rigid sense of right and wrong. And that's really helpful from a developmental perspective. But it's important as we move into adulthood that we question those paradigms and really make sure that it's what's true for us as an individual. And you can do that even in a faith community. Because there's obviously going to be variance in what works for one person versus another person. And so that rigid relationship to a black and white way of seeing the world or belief structure is another reason that self-forgiveness is harder. The biggest reason that it's harder is that it's more painful. That's my experience. When I started forgiving myself for the impact that I had on my son during my addiction, it would literally knock me to my knees when I got present to the pain. And frankly, I wouldn't have stayed present to the pain had I had any alternative. But I'd tried everything else. I'd already tried drugs. I'd tried suicide. Nothing else was working. I wasn't going to die. And so I realized I had to process the pain. And that was one of the big moments when I realized just how powerful that was, just how powerful it was to respond to my own pain with compassion and tenderness. And what I realized is I felt a little bit lighter and a little bit freer every time I did it. And eventually it became much easier and less frequent.
I'd love to hear you comment more on self-identity and labels, because I know for me, a lot of times when it comes to self-forgiveness, I think it always comes back to the labels and identities I've created for myself in my own mind, whether that be like, well, I'm just the guy who's always going to find a way to mess it up in the end, or, I'm just the guy who's going to be unemotional, so I'm always going to let people down because I can't get in touch with my emotions. And I would just love to hear, like, how do you overcome those identities you give yourselves, because they just seem to like it's like a sticker you can't rip off sometimes.
Yeah. So the two places that I would start is, and I'll start with the compassionate one, is by responding to yourself with kindness when that happens. That's the magic sauce in all of this, is really just learning to respond kindly and compassionately to yourself, whether you're forgiving yourself or someone else. And the other thing I would do is ask what you get out of it. So we don't have, identities randomly. We pick them up because they served us. And then they stop serving us at some point, and it feels like a sticky sticker, right? Like a label that we can't get off. But we have to, if we can go back and, gently explore, how it served us in the past, for a man that, has a hard time expressing emotion, that's not a hard stretch to understand. You grew up in that environment, right? Yeah. Everybody was that way. You were told to, don't cry, so that's totally understandable. I get it, Unfortunately, it's causing a lot of chaos in the world, so I hope everybody will fix it soon. But
right.
But yeah, so two things. What do you get out of it? Ask it gently. Ask it in prayer. Where did this come from? And you'd be surprised. When an inkling of how it serves you comes to you, it gets a lot less sticky.
Yeah, that is all just so powerful. It's amazing just how this is all syncing up with stuff I've been learning lately. Like you said earlier, in regards to how to not be a victim in your forgiving, because you can forget your sense of your own self, like your own power, and it comes back to what we're talking here about the labels we give ourselves. And I just want to stress to our listeners, like, this really is like, just so it's seeming so simple, but so powerful and profound if you've never heard of this stuff before. And perhaps even if you've never walked through anything super hard yet in life, it might just be like not being open to feelings you don't even know are there, you know? So, I don't know. I just want to say thank you so far. This has been so great.
I had one more question for this section, and I'll apologize at the beginning because it might take me a minute to actually ask it because I'm still kind of processing through it. But as much as our culture gives this message that's like, you're perfect just the way you are, I actually think that we're not taught well to love ourselves as we grow up. And in my job as a youth pastor, I work a lot with junior high and high school students, and I see the concept of performance and being self-critical, what's taught over and over again of like, oh, you got a B, why didn't you get an A? What do you need to do to get that B up to an A? Like, oh, you made JV, why didn't you make varsity? How do we get you there? And it's all, how do you get the best grades? How do you get into the best college? How do you get the best job? How do you make the most money? And so we're just wired from an early age to be so self-critical and not have grace for ourselves or love for ourselves. And I guess my question is, how do we begin to undo all of that wiring? And how do we begin to learn self-love? Because I imagine all of that has to go into our difficulty to forgive ourselves when we mess up.
Absolutely. It's a huge component of it. You know, the Dalai Lama says, if we taught compassion in schools, the world would be a fundamentally different place. So true. Self-forgiveness, self-love is a component of forgiveness. And for a lot of people, you know, it's a absolutely foreign concept. But that's really just the way we're raised, as you said, you know. So the question is, how do you begin to experience self-love? And a really practical way to do that is to sit quietly and get present to your experience of love for another person or a pet, and really embody that experience. So, you know, I do this in meditation with clients and at workshops where we put our hands over our hearts and we visualize the person. Maybe it's a moment in time that was really special, or maybe it's just a relationship, and just begin to really get present to what that experience of love feels like in your body. And then visualize yourself as a child. And first, when you first start doing the exercise, it's helpful to notice the shift. So what oftentimes will happen is we'll go into self-critical mode, right? Because that's the way we're raised. And we could have a philosophical conversation about the way we're raised, but I'll just stick to practical guides to forgiveness. Notice how it changes, because for most people at the beginning of the process, it does change. Either we experience numbness, which is the most common response, or we experience being self-critical, or just a sense of disconnect, fear. For anybody that might have had a challenging childhood, they might experience fear. And then we go back to the experience of love for the other person, and we intentionally extend it to that younger version of ourselves. And the reason it's helpful to start with a younger version of yourself is because it's easier, right? It's easier to look at the 3-year-old version of you and really allow yourself to fully embody that experience of love for that version of you. And something really magical happens when we extend love to the younger version of ourselves. And that is, we begin to be able to experience it when we do this with practice for ourselves today. So I'll give a quick example of just how powerful this is. I learned this year, actually late last year, of some things that happened during my addiction in my family that were extremely horrific. And I wasn't there. And it was sort of a worst nightmare scenario. And I just found out about this last year. So I obviously cried intensely and experienced a lot of sadness. It was in an interaction with another person, so I dealt with the interaction. And then I went into my bathroom and I looked in the mirror and I said, I love you. We're going to get through this. And that's really how I felt. I really felt such compassion for the pain that I felt for not being there at that moment in time. So it is possible to have the same experience of love for other human beings towards yourself. We just have to learn because we weren't taught. And for those of you who are parents, I would encourage you to, take time to teach your kids how to do that. And first take time to learn it for yourself, because you can't teach something you don't know. But then, I'll create space for them to have compassion and tenderness towards themselves, no matter what grade they get, no matter how bad they mess up. Having love for yourself will compel you to do the right thing more than any sort of punishment ever will.
So we've talked a lot about what forgiveness looks like and how to best deal with it and approach it. But I would like to get into more nuts and bolts ways of talking about forgiveness. And so when it comes to situations where we need to be forgiven and ask for forgiveness, or we need to forgive someone else, what does that look like in a more nuts and bolts approach? Because I know a lot of times, I think sometimes, at least for me personally, it never gets to that point because you just start worrying about, well, like, what's the best way to ask for forgiveness, or what's the best way to show that you have forgiven, and then you just don't do it because there's all these different ways it unfolds in your head, and it's almost like, well, none of those look good, and so you just don't do it. So how would you recommend, when it comes to either asking for forgiveness or forgiving someone, what that looks like?
Yeah, so forgiving someone else, I would not encourage most people to involve the someone else. There are situations that are an exception. A really supportive spouse, a really supportive parent, although parents often have narratives and stories, so that becomes challenging. A sibling sometimes. But for the most part, you give away just a teeny bit of your power when you involve someone in the process of forgiving them. The other thing that you do is you might subtly begin to create what's the word I'm looking for? A bargain. And you don't want to do that. You want to keep it pure and you want to keep it personal. It's about you processing your pain. And so from a very practical point of view, most of the time, I would encourage people to not engage interpersonally if they're forgiving someone else. Now, if you are asking for forgiveness, I would get really present to the sadness or the regret that you feel, and I would communicate that. And I would eliminate all expectations. When we tell someone that we really need them to forgive us, it can make their journey harder. So I'll use my son as an example here. When I first started going through the process, I would tell him over and over, and I'm sure you know somebody like this, over and over and over how sorry I was. I was just so distraught. And that was authentic. Truly, I was distraught. And I truly just needed him to forgive me so badly. I realized after some time that two things were happening. The first thing that was happening is I was asking him to do part of my work for me. And the other thing that was happening, because he's my child especially, is I was really kind of subtly telling him that I'd done something that had taken him off his path, that somehow he was other than he was supposed to be because of the experiences that he had. And I don't think that's knowable. Do we want the people that we love to suffer? No. But is suffering inevitable in the world? It kind of is. So it must have some sort of purpose. And that's when I begin to defer to something greater than me. And so I think it's important to express your remorse, but to give the people in your life space to have their own journey, whatever that looks like for them. And also simultaneously forgive yourself. That's where your power is.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way before, that having an incessant need to continually bring something up, apologizing and asking for forgiveness is basically saying, you're really, really messed up and it's my fault. And I just need you to admit that I completely messed you up so that you can make me feel better.
Yeah.
Right. And the other point is equally as like mind-blowing as when you said you're asking them to do your work, because it's like a lot of times we'd be saying, I can't forgive myself until you forgive me, which puts it all back on them, which again goes back to all this theme of just the work you have to do within yourself. Yeah, it's so good.
If we kind of end this conversation by looking at the church and the faith community, I guess the first place I would want to start is, I know a lot of people have been hurt by the church in some form or fashion. And what does it look like in a situation where you need to forgive an institution or a type of person or a group of people? Because I can imagine that maybe that looks differently than when it's between you and an individual.
Well, a church can't hurt someone unless it falls on them.
Right.
But people in a church might hurt people, right?
Yeah.
People in authority might hurt people. And that definitely changes the dynamic, especially when it causes you to challenge your beliefs and your faith. So I think it's important to recognize that, the harm that's caused in the world is caused by people for the most part. And that's not always the case. There are obviously natural disasters and other phenomena that might take place. But when we can really get present to the pain, so that's a more challenging situation because it's more painful, right? Not only are you losing, your sense of safety from another human being, but you're losing it from another human being who has authority and who has, influence on your faith, on your worldview. And so that's very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? A sense that we lose ourselves, right? Like our sense of who we are becomes challenged. And so it's more difficult for the same reason self-forgiveness is more difficult, because it's extraordinarily painful. And because we also, our belief structure and our faith plays an integral part in forgiveness, no matter what that is. And all the monotheistic religions have forgiveness as a central tenet, and a lot of the non-monotheists, I'm not even going to try. Monotheistic religions also have it as a central tenet. And so Now I lost my train of thought. It's amazing I went this long without losing my train of thought. It happens all the time.
Me too.
I mean, all the time. I don't even worry about it anymore. It's worse when I'm on stage. So if forgiveness is an integral part of your faith, then we have to reconcile the undermining of that faith in the forgiveness process. And it can be done, but it is painful. It's painful because we have to regain our sense of who we are. And sometimes it's also painful because we lose community. But, this is a good example of better questions. Churches can't hurt people. They just can't. People in churches can hurt people, and people in authority can hurt people. And forgiveness gets a lot easier when we recognize that. When we recognize that we're forgiving people for actions. You're also not forgiving someone for their character. You might think someone is a total jackass, but I guarantee you his mother doesn't. That's not objectively true. How can you forgive someone for an opinion? You can't. You're going to get stuck in a mental loop if you try to forgive someone for a judgment that you have about them. Judgment is the antithesis of forgiveness. It's absolutely about unraveling the attachment we have to our judgments. And so if you begin with a judgment, you're going to get stuck. And that's okay, because eventually we'll recognize that we really need to forgive because we feel hurt. And that is the result of something that happened. Does that make sense?
It does, for sure. And we want to honor your time. I think we could all kind of drill more down on a lot of this. But as we end, if we can, I'd love to ask you one more question before we let you plug some of your work. But to sum kind of all of this conversation up, with our show, we like to ask better questions that typically do one of two things or both, that bring unity or bring people together and call us into action. And I was just wondering, and I hope this doesn't put you on the spot too much, but I was just wondering, to sum all of this up, what do you think the better or the best questions are that our listeners can begin asking in terms of forgiveness that will lead them down the road of being called into action, or to bring unity, or even just to begin a journey of forgiveness for themselves?
I think one of the most powerful questions we can ask in the presence of an experience of heart activation, whatever that looks like for you. So being still, so not a philosophical conversation, is, what do I want? Because forgiveness is about alleviating suffering. It's about empowering individuals to contribute more fully to their world. And we do that by processing the pain that we feel. And so, when we get quiet and we reflect on what we want, I think for most people, the answer isn't revenge. The answer isn't, it isn't even justice for most people. It's peace, right? It's community. It's a sense of connection. It's a sense of understanding and harmony in the world. So I think a really good question in the presence of an experience of love is, what do I want? How can,
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I was wondering, maybe just one last thing we could end on, especially since so many of our listeners and us ourselves are in a church context, in a faith community. Many of us are even in a pastoral role in some way. It's not always us in a situation where we need to forgive, but a lot of times we are alongside someone who is walking through the process of forgiveness. And you've mentioned many times about how painful that can be as you have to address the hurt, address the emotions that you have. So what are some of the ways for the church to be most supportive to people who are going through this painful process of forgiveness?
So I think I'm going to answer this question, and then I'm going to answer one more question. I hope you all don't mind.
We love questions.
Yeah, I can't not address one other thing that we didn't get to. So I think one of the most helpful things that people in leadership in the church can do is to help people understand that there's a distinction between the human condition, the human process of forgiveness, and that it requires intentionality, that it requires choice. And oftentimes it requires choice over and over and over again. Every time we get present to the pain again, we choose it again, right? Every time we have a hateful thought, we choose it again. And it becomes a virtue, it becomes a discipline, just like anything else. And so I think one of the biggest challenges in faith communities is that, that the confusion between, the forgiveness from God, and that somehow it's going to be external. And, if that's true for you, then it's true for you. And that's really, really, really important. But there's also an aspect of it that fully requires a choice and an intentionality and an effort on the part of the individual. And it's 100% doable. It's like 100%. There's nothing special about me, right? The only reason I figured it out is because I tried everything else, right? So it's anybody can do it. It's just a matter of, are you going to choose to do it? And do you go back to that question, what do you want? Do you want to contribute more? Do you want to be free from the burden of the things that have happened in the past? And if the answer to those questions is yes, then supporting someone through the process of forgiveness is a massive blessing for them. People not in a faith community don't have that, but the process isn't different. It's the same.
For sure.
And did you get your other question in there too that you wanted to?
I did not. So we did not talk about forgiving God.
Oh, I would love to talk about that.
Right? Don't we need to just momentarily
Yes.
talk about that?
Let's just talk about that.
Yeah. So, there's debate about whether or not the need for forgiving God should exist, because if God is perfect, then God can't make mistakes, right? And that's a very interesting philosophical conversation. But on a practical level, when someone experiences something that is not the fault of another person, it might be the circumstances that they were born into, independent of the actions of the parents, maybe the unexpected death of somebody. Anything that happens that is not necessarily at the hand of another person, if a person of faith has that experience, they may feel that they need to forgive God. What I believe about that is a question of reconciling your experience of the divine. So if you believe in a benevolent God, then there's an aspect of your faith, there's an aspect of your perception of that being that is outside of that. And so the concept of forgiving God is really about examining what your faith is and what do you believe in? Specifically, what do you believe in? Because if you believe in something that creates beauty in the world, if you believe in something that, creates miracles and, is a God of love, then the need for forgiving that person goes away, that deity goes away. But Another important aspect of that is recognizing that the need for forgiveness always begins with our perception that something in our life or about us is other than it's supposed to be. It always begins that way. So if you believe that nothing is other than it should be, then the need for forgiveness does not exist. Mm. So in tandem to questioning what you believe in is also the question of what is it that you perceive to be other than it should be. So if you unexpectedly lost a loved one, what is it that you perceive to be other than it should be? You perceive that that person shouldn't have died, or that that child should not have been abused, or whatever it might be. The process of forgiving in that context is a reconciliation of faith that things happen that maybe we can't understand or know. I believe, and I know, maybe not everybody believes this, but I believe that everything happens for a reason. And, in the context of my own life, the reconciliation of the extent of suffering that I've experienced and that the people in my life have experienced is about contribution. It's about our ability to overcome limitation and love in the face of atrocity. And Desmond Tutu and a lot of other people in a lot of different cultures would have probably the same thing to say about that. Do we wish atrocities didn't happen? Of course we do. The question is, can we have faith that things are the way they are anyway and still have an experience of love and gratitude for our lives?
I really appreciate that you brought that up, because I think one thing I've heard you say over and over again is that so much of forgiveness has to do with perception. And so even if what I think happened is not actually what happened, I still have feelings of bitterness and anger and resentment toward what I think happened that are going to continue to eat me up inside unless I choose to forgive. And sometimes the reality is we feel that way toward God because of what happened, regardless of whether God is responsible for it or guilty of it or not. And so I think that's an experience everybody has, even if they wouldn't want to admit that they have that. So I appreciate you bringing that up, if nothing else, just to normalize that experience for people.
And you know what? That pain is real. It's just as real. And so, question your faith, question what you believe in, and analyze it, and decide, what kind of God you want to believe in, but also honor that pain, honor that sadness, and that's when that tool of self-love becomes really, really powerful.
Well, this has been a really great conversation that could go much, much longer. And one thing that I've really appreciated about this conversation is how practical a lot of your answers have been. And I know in your book and a lot of the work that you've done, you give some really practical steps for people who want to begin the process of forgiveness, of some first steps they can begin taking. So where can people go to find your work, to start diving into all of that information that's available?
So my book is called The Power of Forgiveness, A Guide to Healing and Wholeness. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you're in Austin, it's also in the local bookstores. So that's a great place to start. It is a very practical guide. There are 8 steps that walk a person through the process in a really intentional way. You can also go to my website, which is emilyjhooks.com. I post blogs all the time on there. Like I said, the last one is about why self-forgiveness is so hard. I talk about all this idea of story and what happened. I have a blog post on that. There's a ton of information on there now. And I also have a Facebook page for my book and a Facebook group called the Forgiveness Academy. So, and I speak all the time, but you have to watch on Facebook for that.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and having this conversation.
Yeah, it really has been so much fun. If I could do this once a week, I'd be so, I'm not even kidding. I listened to several of your and I'm not a podcast listener, honestly, and I just think you're right on the money with having conversations that really, really matter. So thank you for
thank you. We worked really hard to try and find the right type of podcast we wanted to make, and so it's really great to hear that we're in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Emily. Well, thanks again for your time. Have a great night.
You too. Bless.
I like how she thought of the best question, and she was like, we're the ones who are interviewing you.
Yeah.
And she thought of the whole how do you forgive God? And I was just like, oh my goodness.
I was like,
how did we not think of
I
that?
almost said this in the thing. I was like, man, we had 5 sections to this and we somehow missed.
Yeah.
That must reveal some sort of weird bias we all have.
And what's funny is we literally, just a couple weeks ago, finished a sermon series at Current on forgiveness, and one of the weeks they did was on forgiving God, and it still wasn't even on my mind when I put those questions together.
Well, even when she said it, there was a split second where I went, oh, can we go there? And then I was like, oh wait, yeah, we should totally be able to go there. That's what 90% of the Bible is.
Right.
It's trying to figure out how to forgive God.
That's 90% of the Bible. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
It's just it's at least 90% of the Old Testament.
Well, there's so many Psalms that are the writer crying out why have you abandoned me?
Yeah.
You know,
what we should do is cut out all the part of her bringing it up and just real quick right now record, be like, so I have a question for you. How do we forgive God?
We have a question that we wrote well in advance, and we would hate ourselves if we didn't think of it, but luckily we did think of it, and it's this. What happens when we need to forgive God?
I actually thought her better question of what do I want was also a really good question.
Fantastic.
When you think about it, ultimately, that's the question we should be asking, because all the bad questions that aren't helpful, it's if we really say, well, what do I want? And what do I want is to get rid of the suffering I'm experiencing from this hurt. Well, then that completely changes the way we approach it. Then if what I want is to be proven right, or to make you pay, or to, which ultimately, what she said is true. The question is, if your desire is, I want you to pay, the deeper desire is, because I think if you pay, then my suffering will go away. So that was perfect. And she just that.
Well, that music you hear right now is a sign that this episode of the Better Questions podcast is over. And, I really loved that conversation we just had. And the last couple episodes where I wasn't here present, I got thrown under the bus a couple times. And I've been inspired to practice forgiveness. And against my better judgment, I'm going to forgive Chris and Dan for throwing me under the bus so many times when I wasn't there. So guys, It's all under the bridge.
Good thing your ability to forgive us isn't contingent upon us being sorry.
I mean, it would be great, but also like, I guess I forgive you guys or something like that.
Well, if you were as inspired by this conversation as Andrew was, why don't you go ahead and subscribe either on YouTube or on whatever podcast app you use so that you can be notified every time we release an awesome new episode of the Better Questions podcast. Also, if you don't already follow us on social media, we're on Facebook and Instagram. And if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and share it so that other people can be blessed as well. Hey, thanks again for listening to the Better Questions podcast. We'll see you next week. That's not even
Batman?
close.
Every time I listen to the podcast, I'm like, okay, trying to remember this song, and then I just can't.